I carry the heart of blind loyalty to the extreme nationalism of Nazi Germany. He was the man who gave birth to the most classic defensive combat doctrine in modern world history. With his sophisticated and audacious combat style, he not only made his enemies wary at the mention of his name, but even the fascist leader Hitler had to be somewhat fearful of him. However, unlike the desert fox Erwin Rommel or other field marshals who were professional soldiers, he is considered responsible for the deaths of nearly 1 million Soviet people, an unforgivable enemy of progressive humanity. That figure is none other than Field Marshal Otto Walter Model, Hitler's most talented field marshal and the most loyal disciple of the German fascist regime. He began his military career during the First World War. However, the name Otto Walter Model only became widely known after Operation Barbarossa from June 22 to December 5, 1941. As a panzer commander, Model, along with the 3rd Panzer Division, then part of Army Group Center under the command of Guderian, executed a blitzkrieg attack into Soviet territory. Very quickly, this officer, born in 1991, made a strong impression on the entire German army as the man who led his troops to the banks of the Dnieper River. By July 10th, Model was able to lead his forces across the river with a 3-pronged attack. Specifically, the first prong was a group of mechanized infantry that advanced to seize a bridgehead, preventing the Soviets from ambushing or blowing up the bridge. The second prong consisted of tank units that would cross under the cover of overwhelming supporting fire from the infantry. As a result, this operation was a resounding success, earning Model the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. Despite this, Walter Model was only truly recognized as one of the most talented commanders in the history of modern warfare, earning the title Savior of the Eastern Front when the Battle of Moscow took place. This event marked the beginning of the Wehrmacht's lightning-fast advance slowing down as winter was arriving across the vast territory of the Russian people. Indeed, Germany's most elite soldiers were always ready to defeat any enemy, except for those who were not human. For the German soldiers on the Eastern Front, those were the bone-chilling blizzards, the seemingly endless quagmires of mud. Sticky and viscous like glue, it clung to everything. It spared nothing that could help the German soldiers move, from tanks and trucks to horses and the very feet of each soldier. Even the rifles and ammunition of the fascist soldiers were in a constant state of shortage and malfunction due to poor maintenance. Yet, on October 2, 1941, the German army had to continue its assault on Moscow under extremely terrible conditions. In light of this situation, on October 18th, Model was promoted to General of Panzer Troops, and on November 14th, he was sent to command a tank corps stationed in Kalinin, 160 kilometers northwest of Moscow. Witnessing the horrifying scenes of starving soldiers in thin uniforms, going mad from parasites, yet still having to fight in the hope of capturing some temporary shelter, Model personally went to the battlefield to boost the morale of his troops. At the same time, he eliminated almost all cumbersome administrative procedures. This left his staff officers utterly bewildered. By December 5th, the German forces under Model's command had managed to advance to within 35 kilometers of Klin. Not long after, the Soviet army launched successive, massive attacks against the German forces. At this point, the advantage had begun to shift. In stark contrast to the miserable plight of the German army, every Red Army soldier was now well-equipped in every aspect and stood ready to annihilate any German soldier they encountered. The inevitable result was that the entire German army was driven from the gates of Moscow. At this critical juncture, Model was ordered to cover the retreat of the German army, which was in a wretched state, to the defensive line along the Lama River. In this extremely perilous situation, Model realized that when attacking, instead of using traditional column formations, the Red Army often used human waves, relying on their massive numbers and extremely strong logistics resources. According to this method, Soviet Army wings would launch successive attacks on German strongpoints. To counter this type of assault, if one defended with all their might to protect key positions in the traditional way, they would quickly become exhausted. And if just a few defensive lines were breached, the attacking force would immediately flood in and neutralize the entire defensive system. However, Model also recognized the Red Army's fatal weakness. Their mobility was still too poor. They couldn't move a large enough number of soldiers into the gaps of the German strongpoints in a short amount of time. Thus, he ordered the German soldiers to disperse their defensive formation into multiple layers, while concentrating mobile armored and artillery units with high maneuverability right behind these defensive layers. This way, once the Soviet army broke through and entered the gaps in the German lines, they would be attacked and annihilated by the mobile and artillery units before they could completely neutralize the German defenses. As a result, this tactic saved the German front lines from being crushed by the overwhelming power of the Red Army. After the Battle of Moscow, Model was transferred to command the Ninth Army, stationed at Rege. Before assuming command of the Ninth Army, he had a meeting with Hitler and the Chief of Staff. Recognizing his aggressive fighting spirit, willingness to sacrifice, and innate command genius, Hitler placed his full trust in Model, entrusting him with the crucial task of restoring the German army's dominance on the Eastern Front. Afterwards, Hitler couldn't help but exclaim to others about Model, "Did you see his eyes? I trust he will get the job done, but I would not want to serve under him."
Returning to Model, after he came back to the front in early 1942, he found the German units in an extremely critical situation. The Soviet Kalinin front had just shattered the defensive lines, directly threatening the vital supply route of the German Army Group Center, the line running from Vyazma to Moscow. More importantly, instead of facing incompetent commanders who had been executed on July 22, 1941 for failing to carry out their duties, Model was now facing a battle-hardened Red Army under the command of some of the most brilliant commanders in Soviet history, such as Marshal Andrei Ivanovich Yeremenko. Of course, that did not deter Model. The moment he saw the Soviet supply lines facing some obstacles, this most outstanding defensive general of Nazi Germany ordered a surprise counterattack, shattering the formations of the Soviet 39th Army. Also during his time with the 9th Army, the general perfected his own theory of warfare with these core points. First, continuously update intelligence from sources on the front line and reconnaissance teams. Second, the front line must be continuous, regardless of which point is weak or strong. This contradicted the classic defensive theory of strong points at the front with reserves far behind. Third, use mobile reserve units capable of moving to weak points when attacked by the enemy. For example, tank forces would be dispersed to key locations only when necessary, instead of being concentrated in one large group that could not be deployed flexibly along the length of the front. Fourth, artillery should be concentrated in one place, ready to provide suppressive fire, unleashing its full force to bombard the enemy's spearheads. Fifth, build defensive lines consisting of multiple parallel layers to increase the effectiveness of stopping the enemy's advance. Hitler was not pleased with these layered defensive lines, fearing that soldiers would not fight to the death, but would instead retreat to the lines behind them. But Model, with his famous retort, "My Führer, who commands the 9th Army, you or I?" continued to build the fortifications as planned. With this style of defensive warfare, Model not only held his formation for 2 full years from 1942 to 1943, but also had enough forces to send reinforcements to other units. Although he was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with oak leaves and promoted to Colonel General for his initial successes with the Ninth Army, Model's reputation had not truly spread beyond the ranks of the Nazi army. That changed when he defeated the Soviet Army's Operation Mars, so decisively that even the great Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov had to admit it was one of the Soviet Union's heaviest defeats in the war. The savior of the Third Reich from then on acquired a new nickname, the Lion of Defense. However, with the balance of military power having almost completely tilted in favor of the Red Army, by March 1943, the Ninth Army gradually withdrew to the line still held by the Nazis. Before the withdrawal, Model ordered the hunting down and massacre of partisans in the area, resulting in the deaths of 3,000 Soviet people. During the retreat, Model employed a scorched earth policy, ordering his fascist soldiers to burn down numerous villages and homes of innocent civilians. And for this chain of crimes, because his retreat suffered little damage, he was once again awarded the Knight's Cross with Swords by Nazi Germany. On July 5, 1943, Model was ordered to lead his forces north to participate in the Battle of Kursk as the main assault force. As usual, he once again faced an extremely powerful Soviet defensive force. But this time, the Red Army brought a big surprise for Model: defensive lines built with depth, many rows, many layers. To counter this, Model once again gambled on a blitzkrieg attack to open a path for his armored forces. But against the solid defensive fortifications of the Red Army, all of Model's attacks were stopped cold. Seizing the opportunity, the Red Army decided to launch an attack on July 12th with the Central, Bryansk, and Western fronts, determined to shatter the German army into 3 pieces. The German offensive, lasting 3 weeks, failed to achieve any of its objectives and suffered heavy losses. The failure at Kursk this time began a chain of successive defeats for Nazi Germany and for Model. After being granted leave at Rastenburg and celebrating his last Christmas with his family, on January 29, 1944, he was urgently dispatched by the High Command to command Army Group North, which was besieging Leningrad. Subsequently, the German forces there were crushed. This forced the Germans to continue their retreat into the Panther Line. At this point, Germany only had footholds left on the defensive lines in Ukraine and Poland. On March 30th, Model was ordered to replace Manstein as commander of Army Group North Ukraine in Galicia. In a desperate situation against Zhukov's attacks, Model once again caused difficulties for Zhukov. By mid-April, Zhukov's forces could not advance any deeper into the defensive layer. On June 28th, Model was sent to rescue Army Group Center, which was dealing with the Soviets' Operation Bagration in Belarus. At that time, the German 9th and 4th Armies were encircled, and the Red Army was about to capture Minsk. Model knew the situation was critical but hoped to hold Minsk. He planned for the 4th Army to break out of the encirclement and called for reinforcements to fight against the advancing Russian forces. But this time, everything was too late. The Soviets' Operation Bagration was a success. The 1st Ukrainian Front, commanded by Ivan Konev, combined with the 1st Belarusian Front, successfully launched the Lviv-Sandomir offensive, attacking Army Group North Ukraine. At this point, Model's specialty, defensive warfare, was employed again, but it was too late. After the 4th Army was utterly shattered by the Red Army, the German front line broke and they had to flee. Fortunately for Model, the Red Army, after a series of rapid advances, had outrun their own supply lines and had to pause to rest. Thanks to that, Model had enough time to both wait for reinforcements and to sweep the partisan forces in Warsaw.
By 1944, Model had commanded 3 army groups on the Soviet-German front, at one point commanding 2 army groups simultaneously, Center and North Ukraine. For this unprecedented achievement, on August 17, 1944, he was awarded the Diamonds to his Knight's Cross by Hitler for his accomplishments on the Eastern Front. After that, he was sent to the Western Front to replace von Kluge. Here, Model sent a letter requesting Hitler's permission to withdraw the German 7th Army and the 5th Panzer Army from the Falaise pocket, and Hitler agreed. However, unlike previous retreats, this time Model suffered very heavy losses of soldiers and equipment. When the Allies entered Paris, Model, after his request for 200,000 reinforcements was denied, was forced to withdraw his troops behind Germany's borders, allowing Paris to fall into Allied hands. Just when the German army seemed to have no hope left, on September 17th, the British launched Operation Market Garden, dropping paratroopers in Arnhem. Seizing the opportunity, the Lion of Defense, Model, launched a large-scale counterattack at Arnhem, ending in a heavy defeat for the Allies. The British 1st Airborne Division was annihilated, extinguishing the Allied intention of capturing the Rhine River before the end of 1944. Immediately after, he continued to launch a series of attacks against the spearheads of the U.S. 12th Army Group, commanded by Omar Bradley, in the Hurtgen Forest and at Aachen. Model's attacks inflicted extremely heavy losses on the U.S. forces. Even though he knew for certain that at this point, only a fantasist like Hitler could believe in the possibility of an offensive to turn the tide, the Lion of Defense, Model, still tried his best to launch new counterattacks. And of course, they all failed. To the point where, when a staff officer complained to Model about the German army lacking everything, Model retorted, "If you need anything, just go take it from the Americans." And indeed, after the Ardennes offensive, despite inflicting the heaviest possible losses on the Allies, the German army was still pushed back in a situation that could not have been worse. After that, Germany's last defensive border, at the Colmar Pocket, was also breached by a joint U.S.-French force, marking the beginning of the Allied invasion, capturing territories on German soil and advancing deep into the Ruhr Valley. With defeat imminent, Model decided to allow the soldiers under his command to flee or surrender. But for himself, he wanted to die on the battlefield, but was unsuccessful. On April 17, 1945, Model confided in his chief of staff, General Karl Wagner, "We have done everything possible to justify our actions in the eyes of history. For a defeated commander, what else is there left to do? In ancient times, they would take poison." And so, to avoid falling into the hands of the Soviets, against whom he had committed so many crimes, when a subordinate officer, Major Vinzens, brought up an offer of surrender to the British-American forces, he shouted, "I cannot possibly imagine that a field marshal like me, who for the sake of victory for our country, sent hundreds of thousands of men to their deaths, would now walk out of this forest, show my face to Montgomery or the Americans, with my hands raised in the air and say, 'Here I am, Field Marshal Model, I surrender.'" And just a few hours later, Model took out his pistol and shot himself in the head, committing suicide in a forest. He was 54 years old. In 1955, his son Hans-Georg Model, who was also a German soldier, exhumed and brought his father's remains to be buried at the Fossenac Military Cemetery. Hans-Georg Model also served as a German soldier from 1944 to 1945.